September the 22nd, 1236. Somewhere in the swamps of Samogisia, near a small river whose name has been lost to history, Master Volkwin of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword wiped sweat from his brow, despite the autumn chill, and surveyed the terrain with growing unease. Behind him 3,000 men, the flower of Livonian crusading power, sat trapped in marshland, their heavy war horses sinking into the bog. Ahead, across the river, Lithuanian warriors gathered, not attacking, just watching, moving closer, encircling. Volkwin, a veteran of Baltic warfare, recognized the trap. The German crusaders who had demanded this expedition, fresh from Holstein and eager for glory, did not. They refused to dismount and fight on foot, unwilling to risk their valuable horses in the swamp, so the army camped for the night, surrounded by darkening forest and hostile territory. When dawn broke on the feast day of St. Maurice, it revealed a nightmare. Thousands of Lithuanian and Samogitian warriors, possibly led by Duke Vikintas, had arrived during the night. Light cavalry mounted on small, agile horses that moved through the marshland like water. They attacked with a weapon the heavily armoured knights had not anticipated: javelins, thrown at close range with devastating accuracy. The unwieldy Livonian heavy cavalry, trapped in boggy ground where their advantage meant nothing, were slaughtered. Master Volkwin died fighting. 48 brothers of the sword fell. 2,000 crusaders and allied troops perished. Of those who fled toward Riga, only 1 in 10 survived, hunted down by Semigalian allies. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword as an independent military order ceased to exist that day. 174 years later, on a summer morning in 1410, another group of German knights would learn the same bitter lesson about Lithuanian tactics. But this time, the stakes would be infinitely higher and the defeat would echo through centuries. July 15th, 1410. The fields between the villages of Grunwald, Tannenberg, and Ludwigsdorf in Prussia. Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen of the Teutonic Order sat astride his warhorse and studied the massive army arrayed before him. 27,000 men under his command, the greatest military force the Order had ever assembled. Knights in plate armour, their white surcoats bearing the Black Cross. Mercenaries from across Europe, guest crusaders seeking glory, artillery pieces rare and expensive, infantry formations. This was the culmination of 2 centuries of crusading in the Baltic, the moment when the Order would crush the Polish-Lithuanian alliance and secure its dominance forever. Opposite him, perhaps 39,000 men stood in formation, the combined armies of Poland and Lithuania, an alliance that should not have existed, united under King Władysław II, Jagiełło of Poland, and Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania. Von Jungingen felt confident. His knights were the best trained heavy cavalry in Europe. His commanders were experienced. His cause was righteous, or so the Order claimed. The Lithuanians had converted to Christianity 24 years earlier, removing the religious justification for crusading, but the Order had simply declared the conversion insincere and continued its wars of expansion. The morning sun climbed higher. Both armies stood ready, but neither moved. Von Jungingen, growing desperate to provoke an attack, sent heralds forward with an insulting gift. 2 swords, the Grunwald swords, delivered with mocking words about how the Poles and Lithuanians might find them useful if they ever actually fought a battle. King Jagiełło, a man who had survived decades of Lithuanian power politics before becoming King of Poland, understood psychological warfare. He did not take the bait immediately. The armies stood facing each other as the sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive. The Teutonic Knights, encased in plate armour, suffered. Von Jungingen tried his artillery, 2 expensive bombards that required teams of men to operate. The unwieldy siege weapons fired, but their shots fell short, doing no damage beyond noise and smoke. A light rain began to fall, dampening the gunpowder and ending the bombardment. Still, the provocation had its desired effect. Shortly after noon, the Lithuanian right wing began to move. Grand Duke Vytautas, commanding from opposite the Teutonic left, signalled his Tatar cavalry forward. These were the same type of troops that had destroyed the Livonian Brothers of the Sword in 1236. Light horsemen mounted on small, shaggy steppe ponies. Under the command of Jilal al-Din, they emerged from the tree line west of the Morozka River and swept toward the Teutonic lines at speed. The Tatars covered the ground quickly, too quickly for the German cannoneers to do more than fire 2 hurried volleys before the riders were upon them. The steppe warriors sabred the gunners and their infantry supports, then turned their full attention to Grand Marshal Friedrich von Wallenrod's banners. For nearly an hour, the lightly armed Tatars demonstrated tactics perfected over centuries of steppe warfare. They darted back and forth around the solid ranks of Teutonic heavy cavalry, never committing to a direct charge. They peppered the Germans with arrows. They used lassos, to pull individual knights from their saddles. The Livonian rhymed chronicle, written by someone who understood Baltic warfare, had described these tactics decades earlier. Light cavalry that refused to stand and fight, that attacked from unexpected angles, that turned the knight's own strengths into liabilities. But the Teutonic formation held. Von Wallenrod's troops, though less elite than those under von Jungingen's direct command, maintained discipline. The solid wall of armoured horsemen refused to break. Vytautas, watching his Tatars make no headway, committed his Lithuanian banners, light cavalry mounted on horses bred for the forests and swamps of Lithuania, not the massive war horses of Western knights. Fighters trained in a different school of warfare, one shaped by centuries of conflict with Mongols, Rus princes and German crusaders. The Lithuanians attacked in waves, first line, second line, third line, hour after hour of fighting in the oppressive July heat. And slowly, inevitably, the mathematics of medieval warfare asserted themselves. The Teutonic Knights were simply better equipped for this type of combat. Their armour was superior, their training emphasised the coordinated charge, their horses were bred for battle. The Lithuanian right wing began to crack. Von Jungingen, sensing victory, ordered his reserves forward. Grand Marshal von Wallenrod's banners surged ahead. The Lithuanian and Tatar-like cavalry, after more than an hour of brutal fighting, broke. They fled from the battlefield in apparent panic, streaming away toward their camp with 9 of von Wallenrod's banners in hot pursuit. The Teutonic Knights, convinced they had won, broke formation to chase the fleeing pagans. This was the moment. The question that has consumed historians for 6 centuries. Was it panic, or was it plan? Polish chronicler Jan Długosz, writing decades later, described it as a complete collapse of the Lithuanian army, a humiliating flight that left the Poles to win the battle alone. Lithuanian historians naturally saw it differently. A feigned retreat, they argued, a calculated tactical manoeuvre borrowed from the very Tatars who rode with Vytautas. In 1963, Swedish historian Sven Ekdahl discovered a German letter written a few years after the battle. It cautioned the new Grand Master to watch out for feigned retreats of the kind used in the Great Battle. The truth, as it so often does, probably lies somewhere between. The Tatars almost certainly attempted a feigned retreat, a tactic they had used to devastating effect for centuries, drawing an enemy into disorganized pursuit, then hitting them with fresh forces while wheeling back to strike the flanks. Vytautas himself had nearly died in exactly such an ambush at the Battle of Vorskla River in 1399. He knew the tactic intimately, but the Lithuanian banners, less familiar with steppe tactics, likely couldn't execute their part of the plan cleanly. What began as a tactical withdrawal probably did descend into genuine flight for some units. The result was a hybrid, part plan, part panic, that sent the entire Lithuanian wing streaming from the battlefield. Von Wallenrod's knights, including most of the guest crusaders who had joined the Order for Glory and Salvation, pursued with abandon. They chased the fleeing Lithuanians all the way to their camp, broke ranks to loot, scattered across the countryside hunting stragglers. From a disciplined military formation, they transformed into a mob of individuals focused on personal glory and plunder. Meanwhile, on the other wing, the real battle had begun. The Polish left, heavy, cavalry commanded by Polish nobles and knights, had watched the apparent disaster on their right with growing alarm. When the Lithuanians fled, panic rippled through the Polish ranks. The professional corps held, but morale wavered. King Jagiełło, positioned with his royal banner, worked to steady his troops. Von Jungingen saw his opportunity. With the Lithuanian wing apparently destroyed, he could concentrate his elite forces, the best troops of the order positioned opposite the Polish formations, against a demoralized enemy. He committed everything. Grand Komtur Kuno von Liechtenstein led the assault on the Polish right flank. Von Jungingen himself, recognizing that this was the decisive moment, led a charge directly at King Jagiełła's position. The fighting became desperate. One Teutonic Knight charged straight at the Polish king. Jagiełła was saved only by his royal secretary Zbigniew Olesnicki, who intercepted the attacker. The Kraków banner, one of the most prestigious in the Polish army, was briefly captured by the Teutons before a desperate counterattack recovered it. The Teutonic reserves swung north around their left flank to surround the Polish right. A detachment went straight for Jagiełła. The Polish right flank was surrounded and crumbling. Only the order from Smolensk, positioned on the Polish right, managed to check the Teutonic advance enough to prevent complete encirclement. For perhaps an hour, it appeared the Teutonic Knights would achieve a stunning victory despite the tactical errors made in pursuing the Lithuanians. Von Jungingen's elite troops were doing what they did best, delivering coordinated charges that shattered enemy formations. The Polish army was being systematically destroyed. And then, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, everything changed. From the direction of the Lithuanian camp, a sound that every Teutonic Knight had learned to dread. The thunder of approaching cavalry, not fleeing, attacking. The Lithuanian and Tatar cavalry had returned. Whether this was the original plan executed late, or whether Vytautas had managed to rally genuinely routed troops, the effect was the same. Thousands of fresh cavalry smashed into the rear and flanks of von Jungingen's committed forces. The Teutonic Knights, who had been surrounding the Poles, suddenly found themselves surrounded. The German chroniclers, even while trying to present their order in the best light, could not disguise what happened next. The Teutonic formations caught between the returning Lithuanians and the reinvigorated Poles disintegrated. The very coordination and discipline that made them so effective in the charge became a liability when attacked from multiple directions. Von Jungingen, attempting to rally his forces, personally led a charge to break through the Lithuanian lines. He died trying, killed by a lance thrust through the throat according to most accounts, though the exact details were lost in the chaos. What is certain is that the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, one of the most powerful men in Eastern Europe, died on the battlefield surrounded by enemy warriors. With von Jungingen dead, the Teutonic command structure collapsed. In an era when personal leadership meant everything, losing the Grand Master meant losing direction. The knights attempted a fighting withdrawal to their camp, hoping to organize a defensive position behind their wagons. The defense failed. The Polish and Lithuanian forces overran the Teutonic camp. More knights died there, according to eyewitness accounts, than had fallen in the main battle. Trapped, surrounded, leaderless, the finest military order in the Baltic was systematically destroyed. By the end of the day, the casualties were staggering. Approximately 8,000 Teutonic soldiers dead, 14,000 captured. Most of the brothers of the order killed, most of the Teutonic leadership dead. The highest-ranking official to escape was Werner von Tettinger, Compter of Elbing. The Teutonic Order, as an offensive military power, had ceased to exist, but understanding how the battle was fought doesn't answer the more interesting question. Why did the Teutonic Knights, experienced warriors who had fought in the Baltic for nearly 2 centuries, fall into a trap that had destroyed the Livonian Brothers of the Sword 174 years earlier? The answer lies in a fundamental clash of military cultures. The Teutonic Knights were products of Western European chivalric warfare. Their entire tactical doctrine, training, and cultural identity centered on the coordinated cavalry charge. Heavy war horses, each costing as much as a peasant farm. Plate armor representing years of a craftsman's work. Lances designed for the initial impact. Swords for close combat. Every aspect of their equipment and training optimized for a specific type of battle. 2 formations of heavy cavalry would meet in open terrain, charge, and the better disciplined or better positioned force would win. This style of warfare had evolved over centuries in Western Europe, where it worked. Generations of knights had proven its effectiveness from Spain to Palestine, from France to the Holy Roman Empire. The Teutonic Order had used it successfully to conquer the pagan Prussians, to defeat Slavic forces, to expand their monastic state into one of the most powerful polities in Eastern Europe. But it was a doctrine designed for a specific type of enemy and a specific type of terrain. The Lithuanians had evolved under completely different pressures. Their military traditions were shaped by centuries of warfare in forests, swamps, and rivers. Their primary enemies had been Mongol raiders, Rus princes, and German crusaders, each requiring different tactical responses. Most importantly, they had learned from the steppe peoples, The Tatars, Mongols, and other nomadic warriors who had swept across Eastern Europe had taught the Lithuanians brutal lessons about mobility, deception, and the effective use of terrain. Lithuanian cavalry were not trying to be worse versions of German knights. They were playing a completely different game. Their horses were smaller but more agile, capable of navigating terrain that would bog down a warhorse. Their armour was lighter, sacrificing protection for mobility. Their weapons included javelins, effective at short range against heavily armoured opponents. Most crucially, their tactics emphasised flexibility, ambush, and the exploitation of enemy mistakes. The feigned retreat was just one tool in a sophisticated tactical repertoire. Historians analysing Lithuanian military records from the 13th and 14th centuries have documented the evolution of their warfare. They intentionally sought out terrain unfavourable for heavy cavalry, forests where the Germans couldn't maintain formation, swamps where warhorses floundered, river crossings where the knights were vulnerable. In such terrain, the Lithuanians would fight on foot, using javelins and melee weapons, negating every advantage the Germans possessed. Some historians have compared Lithuanian light cavalry to the Irish hobblers who served in English armies. Mounted on small horses, equally capable on horseback or on foot, using javelins and hit-and-run tactics. The Teutonic Order had their own equivalent in the native Free Prussians, who had been incorporated into their forces. But the Order's leadership, trained in the Western chivalric tradition, persistently underestimated such troops. The feigned retreat, specifically, was a tactic with deep roots in steppe warfare. The Mongols had used it to destroy army after army across Asia and Eastern Europe. A portion of the force would retreat, drawing impetuous enemies into pursuit. The pursuers would become disorganized, stretched out, separated from mutual support. Then fresh forces would hit them from ambush, while the retreating forces wheeled back to strike flanks and rear. It was devastatingly effective against opponents who valued personal glory and aggressive pursuit, which describes crusading knights perfectly. Vytautas had seen this tactic from both sides. At Vorskla River in 1399, Tatar forces had used a feigned retreat to lure his army into an ambush. Vytautas himself barely escaped with his life as his forces were annihilated. He knew exactly how effective the tactic could be. He also knew its requirements. The pursuing force had to actually pursue, breaking formation and becoming disorganized. There needed to be fresh forces in position to exploit the situation. The retreating forces had to be able to rally and return, and crucially, allies needed to hold firm while the feigned retreat was in progress. At Grunwald, most of these conditions were met. Von Wallenrod's forces pursued with exactly the kind of aggressive enthusiasm the tactic required. 9 of his banners broke formation to chase the fleeing Lithuanians. The Polish forces, despite wavering, held their positions and continued fighting. And the Lithuanians, whether through pre-planning or Vytautas' leadership, were able to rally and return at the crucial moment. The Teutonic Knights walked into the trap because their entire military culture was built around aggressive offence. Crusading warfare emphasised moral courage, personal valour, and the offensive spirit. Knights who hesitated or advocated caution were seen as cowardly. When an enemy fled, you pursued. This wasn't just tactical doctrine, it was cultural identity. Moreover, the Germans had legitimate reason to believe the Lithuanian retreat was genuine panic. They had been winning. The Lithuanian light cavalry had been unable to break their formations. The Tatar tactics, usually so effective, had failed to dislodge the solid ranks of armoured knights. From the Teutonic perspective, they had done everything right, maintained discipline, absorbed the light cavalry attacks, and finally broken the enemy through superior equipment and training. Why would this be a feigned retreat rather than actual defeat? The pursuit was not just about inflicting casualties. In medieval warfare, defeated armies suffered their worst casualties during pursuit, and the capture of high-ranking prisoners was immensely profitable. A fleeing army represented opportunity for glory, ransom, and plunder. For the guest crusaders especially, men who had travelled from across Europe for this campaign, the retreating Lithuanians represented everything they had come for. The Teutonic Order's leadership also made crucial errors in deployment. Von Jungingen positioned his best troops opposite the Polish forces, expecting them to be the main threat. He placed his less reliable forces, including many mercenaries and Polish vassals of questionable loyalty, under von Wallenrod opposite the Lithuanians. This made strategic sense given historical patterns. The Poles fielded heavy cavalry comparable to German knights. Previous battles had been decided by which heavy cavalry force prevailed. The Lithuanians, with their light cavalry and Tatar allies, seemed like a lesser threat. This assessment was based on Western European military thinking, where heavy cavalry was the battle winner. It failed to account for what light cavalry could achieve with proper tactics and terrain. The terrain itself favoured the Lithuanians. While more open than the swamps of Saul, the battlefield around Grunwald included patches of difficult ground. The Lithuanians, familiar with fighting in such conditions, knew how to use every fold in the ground, every patch of soft soil, every slight advantage in terrain. The Teutonic Knights, trained for charges across open fields, were less adept at exploiting marginal terrain advantages. After the Lithuanians returned and the battle turned catastrophic for the Teutons, the difference in tactical flexibility became decisive. The Lithuanian cavalry, designed for exactly this kind of fluid battlefield, adapted instantly. They hit multiple points simultaneously. They reformed quickly after each charge. They coordinated with the Polish heavy cavalry to maintain the encirclement. The Teutonic Knights, built for the linear battle, couldn't respond effectively to attacks from multiple directions. The heavy armour that had been an advantage became a burden. The war horses, exhausted from hours of fighting in July heat, couldn't manoeuvre quickly. The rigid command structure with the Grand Master dead couldn't adapt. The aftermath of Grunwald demonstrated how completely the Teutonic Order had been destroyed. Only 8 castles remained in their hands immediately after the battle. The Polish-Lithuanian forces besieged Marienburg, the Order's capital, though they ultimately failed to take it due to lack of siege equipment and an outbreak of dysentery. But even without capturing Marienburg, the strategic situation had shifted irreversibly. The Order had lost an entire generation of trained knights. Training a knight took decades and cost enormous resources. The Teutonic Order, already struggling with recruitment, never recovered its military strength. Financial burdens from war reparations crippled the Order's economy. Internal disputes racked the organisation as survivors argued over what went wrong. Most importantly, the aura of invincibility was shattered. For 2 centuries, the Teutonic Knights had represented unstoppable military power in the Baltic. They were the champions of Christendom, blessed by the Pope, supported by the Holy Roman Emperor. Kings and nobles from across Europe sent their sons to serve with the Order, confident in their righteousness and their might. After Grunwald, that confidence evaporated. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Polish and Lithuanian warriors who had faced the Teutonic Knights with trepidation now knew they could be beaten. Regional powers that had submitted to the Order out of fear began reconsidering their allegiance. The entire political structure of Eastern Europe shifted as the Polish-Lithuanian Union emerged as the dominant power. For the Germans, the defeat required explanation. How could God's warriors, fighting for Christianity against pagans, except the Lithuanians had been Christian for 24 years, but the Order was still calling them pagans, be so completely destroyed? Some blamed tactical errors, particularly the pursuit of the fleeing Lithuanians. Some blamed von Jungingen's leadership. Some questioned whether the Order's wars of expansion had strayed too far from their religious mission. The German chroniclers, even while trying to maintain the Order's reputation, couldn't disguise the magnitude of the disaster. When you read their accounts carefully, between the lines of justification and face-saving language, the truth emerges. The Teutonic Knights had been comprehensively outfought by opponents, using tactics they didn't understand and couldn't counter. The comparison to Saul in 1236 is instructive. Same tactical pattern. Light cavalry drew heavy cavalry into unsuitable terrain. The Germans pursued with overconfidence. The result was catastrophic defeat, 174 years separating the battles, and the Teutonic Order walked into essentially the same trap. This wasn't accident or bad luck. This was institutional blindness. The Order's military culture, training and doctrine were so focused on Western European chivalric warfare that they couldn't adapt to different tactical paradigms. Every time they encountered Lithuanian tactics, they interpreted them through a Western lens. Feigned retreats were seen as cowardice rather than tactics. Light cavalry was dismissed as inferior to heavy cavalry. Mobility was undervalued compared to armour and weight. This wasn't stupidity. The individual German knights were brave, skilled warriors. Their training was rigorous. Their equipment was the best available, but courage and equipment can't overcome tactical obsolescence. The Lithuanians had evolved a style of warfare specifically designed to counter heavy cavalry. The Teutons, despite centuries of fighting in the Baltic, never fully adapted. After Grunwald, the Teutonic Order lingered for decades but never regained its power. The Treaty of Thorn in 1411 imposed harsh terms. Additional defeats followed. By the mid-15th century, internal revolts and external pressures had reduced the once mighty order to a shadow. The final dissolution came in 1525 when Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg converted to Lutheranism and secularized the order's Prussian territories. But the real defeat happened on July 15, 1410, when Lithuanian cavalry used tactics perfected over centuries to destroy an army that thought it was invincible. The lessons of Grunwald echoed far beyond medieval warfare. Military historians studying the battle have identified patterns that repeat throughout military history. The danger of tactical inflexibility. The importance of understanding your enemy's doctrine, not just imposing your own assumptions. The way cultural bias can blind institutions to alternative approaches. These lessons would be learned and forgotten and learned again through the centuries. The Teutonic Knights entered the Battle of Grunwald confident in their superiority, their righteousness, and their inevitable victory. They had the better armour, the better horses, the better training in Western European cavalry tactics. What they didn't have was tactical flexibility, understanding of their enemy, or ability to adapt when their doctrine met its counter. Grand Master von Jungingen died believing his knights would prevail through discipline and courage. Grand Duke Vytautas understood that battles are won by exploiting enemy weaknesses, not by matching strength against strength. One commander thought in terms of chivalric honour and straightforward combat. The other thought in terms of deception, terrain, and enemy psychology. The result was 8,000 Teutonic dead and the end of an era. The Lithuanians didn't defeat the Teutonic Knights despite their lighter equipment and less prestigious military tradition. They defeated the Teutons because they had evolved a tactical system specifically designed to counter heavy cavalry, and because they understood that winning matters more than fighting honourably, according to someone else's rules. When the sun set on July 15, 1410, the fields around Grunwald were covered with bodies. The finest military order of the Baltic Age lay destroyed, and somewhere in the chaos, Lithuanian warriors who had learned their trade fighting Mongols and surviving in the swamps and forests of the Baltic knew they had proven something crucial, that tactics matter more than equipment, that understanding your enemy is more valuable than superior armour, that flexibility defeats rigidity, that the army that adapts survives, and the army that doesn't ends up face down in the mud of Grunwald. The Teutonic Knights had come to Grunwald expecting another crusading victory. They encountered Lithuanian tactics they weren't ready for, tactics their entire military culture had spent 2 centuries failing to understand. The result was catastrophic, decisive, and completely avoidable if they had learned the lessons of Saul, but they hadn't learned. And on a hot July afternoon in 1410, that failure of institutional learning cost them everything. The aftermath of Grunwald rippled across Europe with a speed that shocked both victors and observers. Within weeks, messengers were carrying news of the catastrophe to every court in Christendom. The response revealed how completely the battle had shattered not just the Teutonic Order's military power, but its political legitimacy. In Prague, King Wenceslaus of Bohemia, who had been nominally allied with the order, suddenly found pressing reasons to negotiate with Poland. In Hungary, King Sigismund, who had supported the Teutonic cause, quietly distanced himself from the defeated Crusaders. Across the Holy Roman Empire, noble families who had sent sons to fight with the order received letters confirming their worst fears. The guest Crusaders, men who had come seeking glory and salvation, had found death instead. The political earthquake this caused cannot be overstated. For generations, service with the Teutonic Knights had been seen as honourable, even prestigious. Young nobles from across Europe had joined the order's seasonal campaigns, the Reisen, as a form of military tourism. Fighting pagans in the Baltic was considered virtuous, a way to prove courage while serving God. After Grunwald, this stopped almost overnight. The disaster exposed something the order had tried to conceal. The Lithuanians had been officially Christian since 1386, when Grand Duke Jogaila had converted and married Queen Jadwiga of Poland, becoming King Władysław II Jagiełło. The Teutonic Order had declared this conversion insincere, claiming the Lithuanians remained secret pagans. This justification had always been thin. After Grunwald, it became impossible to sustain. How could God allow his chosen warriors to be so completely destroyed by Christians? The theological implications troubled the medieval mind. The Order tried to control the narrative. They sent their own versions of events to Rome, to the Holy Roman Emperor, to Allied courts. These accounts minimized the scale of the defeat, blamed Polish treachery, and emphasized continued Teutonic righteousness. But too many independent witnesses had seen what happened. Merchants travelling through the region, survivors from Allied contingents, neutral observers, all carried stories that contradicted the Order's claims. One particularly damaging account came from a Silesian knight who had fought with the Order as a guest crusader. His letter, preserved in family archives, was brutally honest about what he witnessed. We were told the Lithuanians were cowardly pagans who would flee before disciplined Christian knights. Instead, we faced warriors who fought with skill and courage, who used tactics we had no answer for, who destroyed our formations and killed our leaders. I survived only because I was knocked unconscious early in the battle and left for dead. When I regained consciousness, the field was covered with bodies. More brothers of the Order lay dead than I had thought existed. Grandmaster von Jungingen's body was found stripped of armour, barely recognisable. This was not a battle, it was an execution. The financial consequences proved almost as devastating as the military ones. The Teutonic Order had funded its military machine through a combination of agricultural revenues from its territories, dues from subject populations, donations from supporters across Europe, and loans from merchants. After Grunwald, all of these revenue streams collapsed simultaneously. Subject territories, seeing the Order's weakness, rebelled or stopped paying taxes. Supporters in Western Europe, shocked by the defeat and questioning the Order's legitimacy, reduced or eliminated their donations. Merchants who had extended credit now demanded immediate repayment, fearing the Order might collapse entirely. The numbers were crushing. The Order owed approximately 300,000 Prague groschens, an astronomical sum, to various creditors. Annual revenue had dropped by more than half. The cost of rebuilding military forces, assuming it was even possible, would exceed anything they could afford. Some historians have calculated that the Order's debt burden after Grunwald, relative to its diminished revenues, made it effectively bankrupt. The Treaty of Thorn, signed in February 1411 after months of negotiation, formalised the Order's new subordinate status. The Teutonic Knights had to pay 100,000 silver marks as war indemnity, an amount so large it required taking on additional crushing debt. They ceded Samogitia to Lithuania, giving up territories they had fought for decades to control. They acknowledged the legitimacy of the Polish-Lithuanian Union, effectively conceding that their wars of expansion had been unjustified. Even these harsh terms represented a kind of victory for the Order. The Polish-Lithuanian forces, despite winning the battle decisively, had failed to capture Marienburg during their siege. An outbreak of dysentery in the besieging army, combined with effective defence by Heinrich von Plauen, had saved the Order's capital. Without Marienburg, King Jagiełło couldn't completely destroy the Order. He had to settle for crippling it. But the human cost couldn't be calculated in treaties or indemnities. The Battle of Grunwald had killed approximately 8,000 men on the Teutonic side. These weren't just numbers. Each death represented years of training, irreplaceable experience, familial connections, economic investment. The Order had lost most of its leadership. Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen, dead. Grand Marshal Friedrich von Wallenrod, dead. Grand Comte Kuno von Liechtenstein, dead. Comte of Danzig, dead. Comte of Schwetz, dead. Comte of Ragnit, dead. Approximately 400 brothers of the Order killed in a single day, more than the Order could train in a decade. The mercenary companies that had formed the backbone of the Order's infantry were gone, killed or scattered. The Polish vassals who had been forced to fight for the Order, and who had been positioned opposite their own countrymen, had largely deserted during or after the battle. The Order's military capacity had been reduced to whatever garrison forces remained in its castles, and those garrisons were now desperately undermanned. The psychological damage to survivors proved equally devastating. Post-battle accounts from Teutonic sources, read carefully, revealed deep trauma. These men had believed in their invincibility. They had been taught that God favoured their cause, that Christian knights could not be defeated by baptised pagans, that their training and equipment made them superior to any opponent. Grunwald shattered every one of these beliefs. One account from a surviving brother written years later captured this psychological collapse. I had fought the Lithuanians before and always prevailed. They were fast but weak, numerous but undisciplined, aggressive but cowardly. This is what we were taught. This is what we believed. At Grunwald, none of it was true. They fought with discipline that matched ours. Their retreat, which we thought was panic, was calculated. Their return destroyed us. I saw Grand Marshal von Wallenrod's banner surrounded and pulled down. I saw brothers who had survived 20 campaigns killed in seconds. When the Grand Master's banner fell, I knew God had abandoned us. Or perhaps we had abandoned God by making war on Christians while claiming to fight pagans. The reference to religious doubt was significant. The Teutonic Order had justified its existence through perpetual crusade. Remove that justification, and what was the Order? A military organisation that existed to make war on Christians for territorial gain. This realisation, spreading among surviving brothers, contributed to the institutional decline that followed. But understanding the battle's consequences doesn't fully explain how the Lithuanians developed such effective tactics. This requires examining the centuries of warfare that shaped Lithuanian military doctrine. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania in the 14th century was the largest state in Europe, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. This vast domain had been created through centuries of conquest, alliance, and absorption of Slavic territories. The military system that built this empire was sophisticated and adaptive. Lithuanian Grand Dukes, unlike Western European monarchs, didn't have the luxury of fighting on familiar terrain against culturally similar opponents. They faced Mongol raiders from the east, German crusaders from the west, Rus princes from the south, and Scandinavian forces from the north. Each enemy required different tactics. Against the Mongols and Tatars, the Lithuanians learned steppe warfare. Mobile cavalry, horse archery, feigned retreats, ambushes. These tactics became part of Lithuanian doctrine. Against German crusaders, they learned to avoid open-field battles where heavy cavalry dominated. Instead, they used forests, swamps, winter campaigns when rivers froze, anything that negated the German advantage. Against Rus principalities, they employed a mixture of direct assault and political maneuvering, sometimes conquering, sometimes allying, always adapting. This created a military culture fundamentally different from Western European chivalry. Lithuanian nobles were expected to be warriors, but there was no cult of honourable combat, no shame in tactical withdrawal, no requirement to fight fairly. Victory mattered, method didn't. This practical approach to warfare gave Lithuanian commanders flexibility that German knights, bound by chivalric codes, lacked. The inclusion of Tatar cavalry in Lithuanian armies was particularly significant. These weren't just auxiliaries or mercenaries, they were integrated allies with their own tactical traditions. The Golden Horde's fragmentation in the late 14th century had created opportunities for Lithuanian Grand Dukes to recruit Tatar nobles and their retinues. At Grunwald, Jalal al-Din commanded Tatar contingents that knew steppe warfare intimately. Their use of composite bows, capable of penetrating armour at close range, their skill with lassos and light lances, their ability to shoot accurately from horseback, all represented capabilities the Lithuanians had learned to incorporate into combined arms tactics. The Teutonic Order, despite fighting Lithuanians for nearly 2 centuries, never fully understood this integration. They saw Tatar cavalry as evidence of Lithuanian paganism or barbarism, not as evidence of sophisticated tactical thinking. When Tatar units used feigned retreats, the Germans interpreted this as cowardice rather than doctrine. This cultural blind spot proved fatal. The terrain of Lithuania itself shaped tactical development. The Baltic region is not suited for large-scale cavalry actions in the Western European style. Dense forests, extensive swamps, numerous rivers, harsh winters, all created conditions where mobility and adaptability mattered more than weight and armour. Lithuanian warriors learned to fight on foot when necessary, transitioning seamlessly between mounted and dismounted combat. They used javelins and spears more than lances, weapons better suited for forest fighting. They developed tactics for river crossings, swamp navigation, and winter warfare that German crusaders, arriving for seasonal campaigns never mastered. The Battle of Karus in 1270 exemplified Lithuanian tactical sophistication. When a combined Livonian and Danish force invaded Saaremaa, an Estonian island, local forces allied with Lithuanians trapped the Crusaders against the coast. The Crusaders formed a defensive position, expecting a frontal assault. Instead, the Lithuanians attacked at night, using fire to create panic, then withdrew before dawn. They repeated this for several nights, denying the Crusaders rest. When the exhausted Germans finally attempted to break out, they were ambushed in terrain that prevented effective cavalry charges. The result was another crushing defeat for the crusading orders. The Teutonic Knights knew about this battle. They had records of previous Lithuanian victories using similar tactics, yet they never substantially modified their doctrine. This institutional rigidity stemmed from several factors. First, the order's identity was built around being elite heavy cavalry. Admitting that this specialization had limitations would undermine their entire reason for existence. Second, the religious framing of their wars made adaptation difficult. If they were God's chosen warriors fighting pagans, their methods must be righteous. Changing tactics implied doubt. Third, the order's recruitment model depended on attracting Western European nobles. These nobles expected to fight in the chivalric style they knew. Adopting Lithuanian tactics would make the order less attractive to potential recruits. Fourth, when Teutonic tactics did work, which they often did against less sophisticated opponents, it reinforced the belief that their methods were superior. Victories against Prussian tribes, minor Rus princes, or rival Christian states confirmed the value of heavy cavalry charges. These successes obscured the fact that against peer opponents using counter-tactics, the order's doctrine had critical vulnerabilities. The rise of Grand Duke Vytautas significantly increased Lithuanian military effectiveness. Vytautas, who had spent years in political conflict with his cousin Jogaila before they allied, had extensive military experience. He had fought with the Teutonic Knights as an ally during his conflict with Jogaila. He had fought against the Teutonic Knights after reconciling with his cousin. He had campaigned against the Mongols, suffering catastrophic defeat at Vorskla River in 1399. These experiences made him acutely aware of both Teutonic strengths and weaknesses. Vytautas understood that Lithuanian light cavalry couldn't defeat Teutonic heavy cavalry in direct charges on open ground. But he also understood that battles weren't won by doing what your enemy expected. His strategy at Grunwald, whether fully premeditated or opportunistically adapted, demonstrated this understanding. By positioning his Tatar and Lithuanian cavalry opposite the Teutonic left wing, he created an apparent mismatch. Light cavalry facing heavy cavalry seemed like a disadvantage, but it allowed Vytautas to employ the tactics his forces specialized in. The feigned retreat, however it actually unfolded, worked because Vytautas had created the conditions for it to work. The combination of Polish heavy cavalry and Lithuanian light cavalry forced the Teutonic Order to fight a two-front battle, requiring different tactics simultaneously. Against the Poles, they needed to match heavy cavalry with heavy cavalry. Against the Lithuanians, they needed to maintain formation discipline and refuse pursuit. They couldn't do both. The terrain selection also favoured Vytautas' approach. While not as restrictive as the swamps of Saul, the battlefield around Grunwald included enough difficult ground to complicate heavy cavalry manoeuvres. The Lithuanians, experienced in marginal terrain, could use features the Germans barely noticed. Small depressions that channeled charges, patches of soft ground that tired horses, subtle elevation changes that affected sight lines and charge momentum. The timing of the Lithuanian return proved crucial. They came back not at the battle's beginning, when Teutonic formations were fresh and organised, but after hours of fighting in July heat. The Teutonic Knights and their horses were exhausted. Their formations were disrupted by combat. Von Jungingen had committed his reserves. The Grand Master himself was in the thick of fighting. At that moment, when the Germans were physically and mentally stretched to their limit, thousands of relatively fresh Lithuanian cavalry appeared on their flanks and rear. The psychological shock alone might have been decisive. German knights, thinking they had won, suddenly faced a nightmare scenario. The fleeing enemy had returned. Their comrades who had pursued were absent or dead. They were surrounded. Their command structure was failing. These weren't conditions that training could prepare men for. Panic, once it started, spread through the exhausted Teutonic formations faster than officers could counter it. The massacre that followed demonstrated what happened when medieval heavy cavalry lost formation integrity. Individual knights, no matter how well trained or equipped, couldn't withstand coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The armour that protected against frontal assault became a burden when trying to respond to threats from behind. The war horses, trained to charge forward, became unmanageable in the chaos of encirclement. The historical accounts from both sides, despite their biases, agree on the completeness of the collapse. The Teutonic force didn't withdraw in good order, it disintegrated. Knights fled individually or in small groups, hunted down by Lithuanian and Polish cavalry. Others tried to reach the Teutonic camp, hoping to organise a defence behind the wagons. The camp was overrun. Some tried to surrender, but in the heat of battle, quarter was rarely given. By evening, the fields around Grunwald were silent except for the moans of the wounded and dying. Polish and Lithuanian forces controlled the battlefield. The Teutonic Order's military power, built over 2 centuries, had been destroyed in an afternoon. The survivors, those few who managed to escape, carried news of the disaster to remaining order castles. Werner von Tettinger, reaching Marienburg, had to organise defences with garrison troops and whatever reinforcements could be scraped together from across the Order's territories. His success in defending the capital during the subsequent siege prevented complete collapse, but couldn't restore what had been lost. The decades following Grunwald saw the Teutonic Order's steady decline. The Peace of Melno in 1422 forced additional territorial concessions. The 13 Years' War from 1454 to 1466 saw Prussian cities and nobles rebel against the Order with Polish support. The Second Peace of Thorn in 1466 reduced the Order's territory to East Prussia and made it a Polish vassal. The final indignity came in 1525 when Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach converted to Lutheranism, secularized the Order's remaining territories, and became Duke of Prussia under Polish suzerainty. The Teutonic Order continued to exist in the Holy Roman Empire as a charitable organization, but its days as a military power ended at Grunwald. The battle's influence extended far beyond the Baltic. Military theorists studying Grunwald identified lessons about combined arms, tactical flexibility, and the dangers of doctrinal rigidity. The feigned retreat as a deliberate tactic entered European military consciousness. Commanders became more cautious about pursuit. The value of light cavalry and proper employment became better appreciated. But perhaps the most important lesson was cultural. Grunwald demonstrated that no tactical system is universally superior. Heavy cavalry dominated in Western European warfare because Western European terrain, societies and military cultures had evolved together. Transplant that system to the Baltic, against opponents with different tactical traditions, and supremacy vanished. The Teutonic Knights' failure was fundamentally a failure of adaptation. They took a tactical system that worked in one context and assumed it would work everywhere. They interpreted enemy tactics through their own cultural lens, rather than understanding those tactics on their own terms. They valued institutional continuity over tactical innovation. These errors are not unique to medieval crusaders. Military history is filled with examples of successful armies that failed when their doctrine met its counter. The French cavalry at Agincourt, the Spanish tercios in the 30 Years' War, the British square at Isandlwana, the French in 1940, all demonstrated that yesterday's winning formula can become tomorrow's catastrophe when facing adaptive opponents. The Lithuanians at Grunwald succeeded because they understood something fundamental about warfare. Battles are not won by the strongest or the bravest or the most righteous. They are won by those who understand the situation completely and exploit every advantage. Vytautas didn't try to beat the Teutonic Knights at their own game, he changed the game entirely. The flying milk bottles that open this story, the P-47 Thunderbolts, represented the opposite of Teutonic rigidity. American designers created an aircraft that broke every rule of fighter design, and when initial tactics didn't work, American pilots adapted until they found methods that did. The Teutonic Knights never made that adaptation. They brought the same doctrine to the Baltic in 1410 that they had brought in 1230. On July 15th, 1410, on fields still marked by monuments today, that inflexibility was finally and catastrophically punished. The thunder that echoed across those fields that afternoon wasn't from American engines that wouldn't exist for centuries. It was the thunder of collapsing certainty, of tactical obsolescence, of an institution learning too late that the world had changed and they had not. Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen died believing his knights would prevail through discipline and courage. He never understood that he was fighting the wrong battle, using the wrong tactics, against an enemy who had spent generations learning how to defeat him. That failure of understanding cost him his life, his order's power, and ultimately the Teutonic state itself. The day the Teutonic Knights faced Lithuanian tactics they weren't ready for didn't create those tactics. It simply revealed what 2 centuries of Baltic warfare should have taught them. That no army is invincible, that adaptation beats tradition, that understanding your enemy matters more than dismissing them. Those lessons were written in blood across the fields of Grunwald, and they remain relevant wherever militaries face opponents who refuse to fight by expected rules.